There, it's a little bit different from the first Cold War because I think it's less about communism versus capitalism, because both countries really arguably are variants of capitalism, or even the types of ideological struggles that were playing out in the first Cold War. But it's certainly authoritarians versus democracy, and it's not an accident that Xi is cozying up to dictators like Putin and even Orban, the most authoritarian leader in Europe, and trying to reinforce that alliance. And he's exporting that ideology as well. So the Chinese have opened up in recent years schools in Africa to train future African leaders in surveillance technology, population control technology, to help institute those authoritarian dictatorships, not necessarily communist dictatorships in the traditional sense of the word, but because they care less about the specific ideological alignment, but certainly dictatorial authoritarian regimes. You have a major regional flashpoints. So I argue in the book that Taiwan is really the new West Berlin. And a lot of people remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as sort of the defining, most dangerous moment of the Cold War.
Yep.
And it certainly was that. But people have forgotten that there was another moment that was just as dangerous and was actually even longer in scope, and that was the West Berlin crisis. It started right after World War II with the confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans and the Berlin airlift that Truman instituted in 1948, but it continued through 1961. And the summer of 1961 was an incredibly dangerous period, right? So the Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days in October of 1962. Half of that time, Americans didn't even know what was happening until Kennedy announced it to the world. But in 1961, the year begins with the Kennedy inauguration, the Bay of Pigs disaster, and Kennedy really wanting a better relationship with the Soviet Union, wanting a detente. He writes letter to Khrushchev to ask for a summit. They have that summit in Vienna in June of 1961. And Kennedy comes in with this agenda of we should not be in this ideological confrontation. Let's find reasonable way to accommodate each other's interests. And Khrushchev wants none of it. And he's got one priority and one priority only, which is to kick America out of West Berlin and its allies. And he gives an ultimatum to Kennedy that unless you leave, I'm going to invade. And Kennedy is shocked. He leaves the summit completely shaken up, thinks that Khrushchev is a madman, and he goes on American television and announces to the country that we're going to be preparing for war. And he articulates that we're going to defend West Berlin, even though it's this tiny enclave of freedom surrounded by East Germany, very, very difficult to defend, but we're going to defend it to the end, including risking nuclear confrontation. In fact, he announces to the public to prepare for nuclear war. He asks Congress to allocate money to identify fallout shelters across the country. I mean, just remarkable, scary times, right? And it went on for weeks and weeks throughout the whole summer. And in mid-August, Kennedy's woken up one day and he's told that the East Germans have started building the wall, obviously on behalf of the Soviets. And you know what he says? He says, "Thank God." Remarkable response, right? Because 25 years later, you have President Kennedy saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall." But Kennedy celebrates it. And he says, it's not a great solution, but it's better than war. And if he is building the wall, Khrushchev, then he's not invading. And ironically, that wall stabilized the conflict and allowed us to get to detente in the 1970s and arms control agreements under Nixon and Ford and so forth, because it signifies the end of Soviet expansionism, that they've basically agreed that they would control Eastern Europe, but they would no longer try to attempt to conquer by force Western Europe, and the Berlin Wall was kind of that border that was built both in a physical sense and in a symbolic sense. And Taiwan is really that crisis right now, right? And if we could build, obviously, a metaphorical wall across the Taiwan Strait and prevent an invasion of Taiwan by China, then we could actually stabilize the Cold War. It wouldn't end. We still have this global competition for supremacy that plays out in every corner of the world. But Taiwan is really that one place where we might go to war with China over because of the critical reasons why Taiwan is important to us. There's no other place where we would confront China. Just like in the first Cold War, there was really no prospect that we would fight the Soviets over anything other than Berlin and Cuba briefly, right? We wouldn't fight them in Vietnam. We wouldn't fight them in Korea. They certainly had no appetite for that. Or really, when they invaded Afghanistan, we weren't going to fight them for that. But Berlin was essential, Kennedy believed, and Truman and Eisenhower, for U.S. credibility, for U.S. projection of power in Europe. And Taiwan is that today. And we're not going to fight China for some rocks in South China Sea that are disputed, or East China Sea. Taiwan is really that one place where you could go to war, and it's an incredibly dangerous period. So, for all those reasons, the two conflicts are remarkably similar. And the one reason that people give for why this is not a Cold War is this economic trade that is enormous between the United States and China. And as I write in the book, we actually had a lot of economic connections to the Soviet Union. I'll just give you a few examples.